CPSE. My name is Purnima Mankekar, and I'm on the faculty in the departments of Anthropology, Asian American Studies, and Film, Television, and Digital Media at UCLA. I'm the faculty convener of CPSE, along with our student coordinator, Emily Pogosian. Today's talk by Professor Kim TallBear is the result of a collaboration between CPSE, the Center for Behavior, Evolution, and Culture, the American Indian Studies Center, and the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA. CPSE is particularly grateful to Professors Clark Barrett, Hannah Landecker, and Shannon Speed for their hard work in making today's event happen. Before I request Professor Shannon Speed of the American Indian Studies Center to introduce Professor TallBear, I'd like to make a few announcements. Next week, May 20th, we will have the pleasure of hearing Professor Jessica Catalino of the Department of Anthropology give a talk based on her book, Water Ties. We look forward very much to learning more about this exciting book. I'd also like to inform those of you who are attending a CPSE talk for the first time about some important matters. Due to a security breach earlier this year, we will have to mute everybody except for the host and the speaker. When it is time for discussion, please message me directly using the private chat function with your affiliation. Please be sure to note your affiliation. I will keep a list and will call on you to ask your question or make your comment in the order in which I see your message. We will unmute you when it is time to speak. Public chat will be disabled for the duration of this event. We will also turn off video for most of the event. I'd like to now invite Professor Shannon Speed to introduce our speaker. Professor Speed is the director of the American Indian Studies Center and is a faculty member in the departments of Anthropology and Gender Studies at UCLA. Professor Speed, take it away.
Thank you, Purnima. Chukma, Tashlata Chukma, Sahochifot, Iguitana, Chikasha, Mechichata Saya, Gabrielino Tongva, Oglakot, Yagni Makon, Apisa Hanchi, Bikanatoka, Hachimanolili. Hello, everyone. I greeted you and welcomed you to today's event in Chickasaw. I also acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovanga, which encompasses much of what is currently called Los Angeles, as well as the South Channel Islands, and upon which UCLA resides. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hunuk Ritam, ancestors, Ahihiram, elders, and Eohingim, our relatives and relations past, present, and emerging. Thank you all for joining us for this special event with our honored guest, Kim TallBear. Dr. TallBear is a citizen of the Sisitumwapidin Oyate of South Dakota and is a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience, and the Environment in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. She's the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promise of Genetic Science. She is a co-founder of the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, SING, in Canada, and also an occasional faculty member for SING USA. In addition to studying genome science disruptions to Indigenous self-definitions, Dr. TallBear studies colonial disruptions to Indigenous sexual relations. She is a regular panelist on the weekly podcast, Media Indigena. So this is Kim's short bio, which she favors, and I'll just say that her accomplishments are so many, and because her impacts across various fields are so rich, her long bio undoubtedly results in a 15-minute monologue by the introducer. And since I'm sure that none of you want to hear from me for that long, I will just add that I had the honor of being Kim's colleague for a short time in the anthropology department at UT Austin. Before that institution foolishly let her get away to Alberta. And while she wasn't there for a long time, her impact was great and long lasting. So it's wonderful to see her and have her here today. Thanks for being with us, Kim. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Dr. Kim TallBear.
Thank you, Shannon. It's nice to see you again. Okay, so I guess I'll just jump in and get started. So we're doing a 45-minute talk and then 45-minute for Q&A, right, Clark? I think that's right. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
that sounds good.
21. So that's going to put me at, what is that? I'm terrible at math.
Oh, we're about,
2:06. Oh, that's my time. My time, 2:06. Okay, we're good.
Yep.
All right. I like to keep track of my own time. Okay, so we're on the first slide. It should say Indigenous STS Governance and Decolonization. I can't see. Okay, I'm going to get rid of, put that small and do that again. Thank you. And I think I was told one of my colleagues from the summer internship for Indigenous Peoples and Genomics US might be in the audience. She's one of your colleagues at UCLA, Nani Garrison. So if I may ask her or anybody else who might be in the audience from Sing USA to come in later during the Q&A if we have questions that revolve around that, because I am sure at some point they will bring Sing to UCLA, since one of the lead faculty in the US is now there. And the Center for, and Center, I'm not sure, Institute for Society and Genetics, it's called now. Okay, so I'm coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory, and in Canada, the treaties between settlers and Indigenous peoples were kind of numbered across the country until they got to British Columbia, and they don't have treaties yet, as I understand it. That's still in negotiations. But I'm in Edmonton, which is the capital city of the province of Alberta, about what is it? It's about 1,000 miles directly north of Salt Lake City, for those of you that don't know. And I'm near the North Saskatchewan River Valley, which is right outside my window here in my living room. And this is a traditional gathering place for multiple Indigenous peoples, including especially Cree, Blackfoot, and Métis in this territory. But there are also Nakota, or my cultural cousins, who fled north. I think during the Indian Wars, Iroquois, Dene, Anishinaabe, and Inuit people. So really a diverse kind of Indigenous cultural community here, and is one of the main reasons I came here, other than I'm a prairie person and I know I have to be there. So the other thing I want to say is a note on terminology, that it's always political and contextual. And of course, you know, those of you who think around indigeneity and Indigenous studies will know this, but it really does change from place to place, especially nation state to nation state, because the relations between Indigenous peoples and colonizers and their governance formations, you know, produce different kinds of language. So there is no universally politically correct term for Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations, tribes, whatever term is relevant in each nation state. So you don't really get to be lazy. I think you have to always be attentive and willing to be corrected on terminology. It depends on where, when, and who you are, right, as to which terms can be used, not used, and most appropriate for use. So you'll hear me today move between terms in ways that might sound arbitrary to the unschooled listener, but there's always a very particular reason for why I choose the term that I do. And do not ever be afraid to ask people, what is the correct term to use when you're, you know, trying to address somebody who's Indigenous. We can go to slide 2. So Indigenous science, technology, and society, or what we're calling Indigenous STS, as we are conceiving it at the University of Alberta with partners across Canada and with scholars globally, supports Indigenous communities and nations to exercise sovereignty, right? And that's a problematic word. It's why I put it in scare quotes, but I don't have time to go into that today. So it's a useful word. Indigenous governance or sovereignty is exercised through legislation, tribal and band governance, if you're thinking about Canada, policy and court cases, but Indigenous governance also includes non-bureaucratic components such as customary laws, individual and collective actions such as critical land defense and water protector actions. I think about all that as governance too. Indigenous peoples also have intergovernmental relations with federal, provincial, territorial, and in the US state governments that aid or hinder Indigenous governance in our communities and our environments. So states in the US and provinces in Canada are notorious, along with the feds, for regularly undermining Indigenous governance authorities. And all of us who work in Indian country, it's a term we use in the US, know that. We don't use that term in Canada so much. So as my co-PI pictured on this slide, Jessica Kolapenik, points out, and I'll just read, you can read along with me. Colonial ideas about race and reason have dually framed Indigenous peoples as objects of scientific curiosity. That's the gist of a lot of my work, critiquing that, and as political wards of state governance who were not rational enough to produce valid knowledge or run real governments. And I would argue that those ideas still really permeate the disciplines in the academy and intellectual thinking. And I regularly will point out how these kinds of latent ideas are still present in our methods and our research assumptions and the way that we do work. So that's, of course a lie, right? These colonial ideas are a lie, but they have been used by colonizer states, including the US and Canada, to justify their theft of all things Indigenous. Indigenous governance is also exercised, and this is why we do this work, via scientific research and technology development, including Indigenous engagement with both Western science, quote unquote, and traditional knowledges, also put scare quotes around that. So like nation states, Indigenous nations govern in part through science. And a lot of my work is about both critiquing the use of science and racist, hierarchical, and colonial ways to govern us in a colonial manner. But that's how it began, pushing back against that. But I've since moved, and a lot of other people and my colleagues across the globe have moved into saying, yes, that, and let's think about how we're going to use science and technology to govern from out of a different set of priorities, a different set of origin narratives, if you will, because of course colonizer societies have their own origin stories and mythological narratives that guide the choices they make and the values that they have. They just think it's those superstitious Indigenous people that have it, not us, right? Because the US separated state and religion. Okay, so slide 3. I should stick to my talk because if I get off on a tangent, I'll run behind. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this Indigenous Science Technology Studies network that we're building. And I don't know if I get to it in here, but I'm just going to say it while it's on the top of my head. When we are conceiving of Indigenous STS, we are not conceiving of ourselves as a subdiscipline of science and technology studies proper, mainstream STS. This Journal for Social Studies of Science is part of that, network. Not that we're not informed by that. Many of us working in Indigenous STS are also active in 4S and in that field, but we are actually viewing ourselves as more of a subfield of Indigenous studies or Native studies, because we have at the heart of what we're doing, while we engage with science and technology studies theories and frameworks, and that work is intelligible and very interesting to us, at the heart of our project is defending Indigenous sovereignty, self-governance, survival, and thriving. That is not the heart of the project of STS. It sometimes gets over to looking at Indigenous knowledges as scientific knowledges, but mostly not, right? Mostly, again, many Indigenous people and ideas and projects are coming into at mainstream STS, but it's still, I would say it's still a small part of it. So don't make the mistake of thinking we're necessarily part of that genealogy. Let's see. So these are just some of the people involved. We had a symposium in Edmonton in 2018, where we were, it was called Towards Sovereign Bodies and Sustainable Relations. One of our keynote speakers there, Max Libaran, who's at Memorial University, Newfoundland, Labrador, has a new book out on Duke University Press. I can't remember what it's called. Somebody might want to put it in the chat. It's brand new, just out. Max is Métis, has a feminist marine science lab at Memorial, and has done some really interesting work on feminist science, Indigenous science, decolonizing science and technology. Max is really someone to look out for, and they have videos and they do podcasting and a lot of stuff that's publicly accessible. And so these are just some of the people that came and presented on their various science and technology, Indigenous science and technology study projects. It's really interesting in that we're disproportionately populated by women, queer, two-spirit people. So that's interesting, and let's see if I have time to get to that. So again, we're first and foremost informed by Native or Indigenous studies, intellectual genealogies, and commitments to Indigenous community and Indigenous sovereignties. But we have been added to that theoretically feminist insights, queer, Black, African insights, and other anti-colonial analytics deployed by our diverse colleagues. So this is something we figured out in doing Indigenous STS and beginning to develop it. We were already in conversation, right? Indigenous science studies scholars are very much in conversation with feminist science studies scholars, who are in conversation with queer and trans science studies scholars. This is all part of 4S and mainstream STS, but we're in conversation because we're all theorizing critiques of the role of science in reproducing these social hierarchies, right? Particularly within kind of global colonialism and capitalism. So we are very much in conversation, even while we are personally centering in Indigenous thriving. But so we have a pretty diverse set of colleagues that come in and help us do this work and think through this work. I said as individuals, we're mostly Indigenous scholars, but we do have non-Indigenous people in our network, and you will see that, right? And they're not They're not Indigenous, they're not necessarily claiming to be, but again, we're in conversation in these ways that are really critical of colonialism, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism in particular. So, the 4S meeting, the Social Studies of Science meeting, which is going to happen this October 6th to the 9th was supposed to be in Toronto. It's actually probably mostly going to be online, of course. We still have heavy quarantine, no moving between provinces, stuff going on up in Canada. We don't have as many vaccines as you all have down south. So we're planning a plenary, a two-part plenary at 4S called Science That Unsettles. And that is a title taken from Dr. McLean's blog. And Dr. McLean is that's his cartoon avatar on the bottom right-hand side of this this slide. Decolonize all the things, and you can look at his blog. So Science That Unsettles refers, of course, to unsettling settler colonialism and the assumptions that arise from it, and which continue to inform scientific practice today. So ideas about who is advanced and who is primitive, even if we're not using that kind of old school in-your-face language, right? We look for those kinds of ideas underlining more nuanced multicultural type language that's acceptable today. We are looking at gender hierarchies and gender binarism, ableism, biological race assumptions, linear and progressive temporal thinking, which is also related to these kinds of hierarchies of savage versus civilized. So the plenary we're going to be doing, Science That Unsettles, is organized according to Indigenous STS frameworks. But again, it's also going to incorporate non-Indigenous scientists and social scientists who work in the aforementioned critical areas. So Drs. McLean and Dr. Smith, who you see, who's the white guy in the lab coat with my co-PI Jessica, who's like doing this Dom thing with her glove. They are both trained in biological anthropology, and McLean also in evolutionary biology, but both of these scientists work directly to unsettle colonial racial formations, again, gender binarism and heteronormative assumptions in their lab and field science. So if you're interested, you should look at their websites, rickwasmith.com and decolonizeallthethings.com. You can learn more about what I'm talking about, how cool their work is. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This will be a little 101 for a lot of social scientists and humanities people, but if there are scientists in the room, it'll be a little good, quick refresher. So science and other STEM fields, in perhaps varying degrees, are typically misunderstood as distinct from politics or explicitly political interventions. So science is supposed to be objective or neutral, but as feminists and Indigenous theorists demonstrate, science is always already situated, right, within certain worldviews and not others. It's produced by researchers and institutions that have certain cultural and political stakes and frameworks about what is ethical and right, and not other frameworks, not other cultural and political stakes, even while rigorous science works to reduce bias via experimental replication and peer review. This is different, though, than performing what Donna Haraway pictured on this slide, she's one of my PhD advisors, calls the God trick. And the God trick is really illustrative of this kind of point. And Donna Haraway wrote that the God trick is about thinking that you see everything while standing nowhere in particular. So if we think about God, God is supposed to be this omnipotent presence and being that sees everything, but we don't see God. We don't see where God stands, right? God is not embodied necessarily. And so this idea that one can have this kind of, all-encompassing worldview. So let's see, where was I? So I use that. I just like that little eye visual that's kind of looking out on the world, but the disembodied eye, right? And so that's what a lot of her work is about, that, and she talks about technological apparatuses that we use to see in the laboratory and in the field, and so the eye is just one technology of visualization. But we have many technologies of visualization that are not as organic as the eye, right? And the idea that these enable us to see neutrally and objectively, but think about the histories behind the development of such technologies, right? And the cultures out of which these technologies are developed, the questions that drive the development of certain technologies and certain research questions. It's not that they're necessarily totally invalid questions, but they're valid given a certain context and time and set of problems that are produced out of a certain political context and social context. A different culture or community sitting in a different place in a different context would come to very different questions, right? So we always have to remember that we always stand somewhere. So to conflate objectivity with neutrality, that's not really a very rigorous way of thinking about this. Yeah, so I'm just going back to my notes. So it's not only Haraway, right? And this is why Indigenous theorists are engaging with Haraway and other feminist thinkers. I didn't kind of make my way to calling myself a feminist until, as an Indigenous critic of science, I came into contact with feminists and feminist science studies scholars in grad school. And I thought, oh, they're asking the same kinds of things. And they had theorized this more than Indigenous or Native studies had. And so that was very helpful for me. The same with, African, queer, Crip, and many other thinkers who are also kind of digging into these kinds of analyses. So along with feminist STS, Black technoscience, Crip technoscience, queer STS, and Indigenous STS studies the intersections of science, technology, and governance, but again, with a focus on Indigenous technoscience and governance. So I'll give you some examples of what Indigenous technoscience and governance looks like. So how can First Nations in Canada or tribes in the US govern consent and ownership of biological samples and data produced in a genetic research project on a condition suffered in their community? There may be, again, summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics, or SING people in the audience who are working on that data sovereignty stuff who might answer that question. I don't work on that, but a lot of we have a lot of Indigenous researchers getting into that area now. A second example is, what is the role of colonialism, and what does that mean? The loss of land, loss of traditional foodways when you lose the land and you lose your relationships through active disruption by colonial powers with non-human relatives that were on your traditional lands. Intergenerational trauma is part of colonialism. So what's the role of colonialism in the prevalence of a particular condition that an Indigenous community might want to use genomics among other areas to study, right? So that's something that's really interesting about thinking about questions that Indigenous people might have, that they might bring genomic research to bear on. They're also often quite conscious of very knowledgeable about the colonial and historical context in which that condition is prevalent, and also want to consider those kinds of social and historical questions alongside the technical questions. Another example is, do non-Indigenous researchers neglect colonialism in favor of hypotheses about Indigenous bodies as genetically deviant? That's been kind of an important critique in some of the long-standing type 2 diabetes research projects that have gone on, right? Where there was an over-focus on the deviant, sick, Indigenous body, and not focus on why are people's bodies so sick, right? What are the social and economic and conditions that are helping produce, sick Indigenous people? Let's go to the next slide. So colonial powers have practiced policy and used science together historically to depreciate and suppress Indigenous lifeways, to seize control of land, to eradicate Indigenous authorities, and erect colonial social systems in their place. Colonialism, including its scientific institutions, all of these lovely universities we inhabit, has justified resource extraction, caused harm to Indigenous peoples and lands, and to other exploited peoples across the planet. Colonial policy, sciences, and technologies have helped bring us, they're part of the solution, but they've also helped bring us into an era of planetary environmental devastation. So I don't like these narratives of science as savior. We can be saviors, but we can also, we're very complicit in the development of these kinds of problems that we're facing right now. And the narratives that drive science and learning are also the same narratives that have driven the actions that have led to the climate crisis we're currently in the middle of. But Indigenous practices historically can also help conserve the planet's biodiversity, and Indigenous frameworks and ways of thinking about the world. So I want to, well, you're in California. I was in California last August, 2019. So the record-breaking wildfires in California and in many other places across North America, after centuries of suppressing Indigenous controlled burns, and just centuries of suppressing and displacing Indigenous peoples who managed the land for many, many centuries or millennia in very different ways than settlers decided they wanted to manage it. So if science is to serve the planet, it needs to serve Indigenous peoples and cultures who have instead been sacrificed. So we really need to think a lot about the entanglements of the way science manages and the way that people are managed and who has been moved around according to what kind of dominant social narratives. So one of the ways to disrupt those narratives that not only inform our social world, but inform our scientific practices is to diversify science. And so science can be made, and this is not just about browning and rainbowing up the lab. That's not even a start, right? Science needs to be made to work ontologically, epistemologically, and ethically for Indigenous and other marginalized communities. Indigenous environmental knowledge can be respected and coupled with biological and climate science to protect Indigenous peoples and the planet. And this is a better science that serves all of us. I have so much more to say on that, but I'm going to move on to the next slide. All right, I'm going to go talk about some, let's see, I have about 25 minutes. I want to just dig into some terms here that we throw around a lot in the academy and out in the world that I don't think we're always on the same page about. So I am taking these terms and definitions from an article published by Adam Gaudry and Danielle Lorenz, two of my colleagues at the University of Alberta, and it was published in the, I think it's an open access journal, Alternative. Indigenization is inclusion, reconciliation, and decolonization. And then they're talking about within the Canadian Academy, but there's many overlaps with the US Academy. So they start out by quoting Rona Kokkonen, who is a Sami scholar, I believe from Finland. And Kokkonen said, conceptually, indigenization represents a move to expand the Academy's still narrow conceptions of knowledge to include Indigenous perspectives in transformative ways. So the transformative is key, and we'll talk about that. So they say there are 3 levels of indigenization. I don't really think about it as 3 levels of indigenization. I kind of cut these terms in half and only use the distinct different terms. But the first one they're calling inclusion. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or EDI as we order the letters in Canada. Inclusion aims to increase the number of Indigenous students and other diverse students in the Academy, supports adaptation of Indigenous students to the Academy, right? Indigenization is conceived of primarily as a matter of inclusion and access. And by merely including more Indigenous people, it is believed that universities can indigenize without substantial structural change. And those of you from other groups that are not Indigenous, a lot of this is going to make sense to you as well. Okay, that's one level. Then they say there's another level, reconciliation. And this is a term I think we use more in Canada because we kind of had a federal, a national inquiry, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has not happened in the United States yet. So reconciliation, they say, aims for common or middle ground, creates a broader consensus regarding what counts as knowledge. We can think about how knowledges can be reconciled. They say what sets reconciliation and indigenization apart from mere Indigenous inclusion, and this is key, right, is an attempt to alter the university's structure, including educating Canadian faculty, staff, and students to change how they think about and act toward Indigenous people. So the first level is just getting more diverse bodies in the door and helping them get in the door and transition into the university culture and life. The second level is actually getting non-Indigenous faculty, staff, and students to change their minds, to learn something about Indigenous people and history, and to change the way they act. So that's on them. So reconciliation often by Canadians is taken to mean, oh, can't we just all get along? Can't we just forgive? It's like, this isn't about us as Indigenous people. This is about you and what you need to do. We're not the purveyors of colonization here, at least not yet, and let's hope we don't get to that point. Okay, I want to move to the next slide and just give you, maybe I should have done this first, the kind of everyday, you know, Merriam-Webster dictionary version of reconciliation, which is not really what we're talking about in the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. These are what I'm calling like settler colonial definitions, the restoration of friendly relations. Well, relations were probably not friendly. So how are you going to restore what wasn't there? The action of making one view or belief compatible with another. That is not what we mean by reconciliation. We're not trying to, that's like, can't we just all get along? Which, you know, usually means in a settler colonial state, can't you just assimilate and act like us? So don't take the dictionary definition of reconciliation. I think that's often what people are thinking out in the public when they hear that term. It's not what we mean. Let's go to slide 8. Now we're going to talk about, let's see. Oh, okay. This is interesting. So I had a little bit of reconciliation on slide 6, and then I have a big one on slide 8. I was wondering what I was doing there. I think I went through all of this already. I did. So that's just a little link on the TRC calls to action if you're interested, where they actually have like a 60-page report. I think that's from the Yellowhead Institute, which is a think tank at Ryerson University in Toronto. They have sort of an interpretation of what that means. You can also get online and get the 60-page document on the Truth and Reconciliation Committee calls to action, where they say, media, here's some things you can do. Universities, here's some things you can do. Healthcare, here's some things you can do to think about actually meeting the mandate of reconciliation. So that's a really interesting document if you're interested in digging deeper into what that idea means. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a quote from a talk that Dr. Rod McInnes, who is a geneticist at McGill University in Montreal, gave when he was president of the American Society for Human Genetics back in 2011. And I thought this was really interesting because this is an interesting moment in sort of the conversations around how Indigenous people are going to be treated ethically in the field of human genome research. I don't like to use the word progress. Because it's like such a US, it's a settler exceptionalist idea. Oh, we're inevitably going to make progress. You don't need revolution. You don't need real militancy because, the wheels of time are turning and eventually we'll all get to the point of this perfect, democracy. So I avoid the word progress, but I'm going to say, I think there's been a little progress or movement in the world of human genetics related to engagement with Indigenous peoples. And that's exactly because Indigenous geneticists have been cultivated who are connected to community. And that means that they have both the scientific knowledge and the grounding in their community relationships to figure out how to work these things together. So it's not enough to just be biologically Indigenous. You really have to have either have engaged or have the capacity to socially engage with those communities, because this is like on the ground, real relations is important for helping do this work, right? That's how you're going to get from just diversity and inclusion to actual reconciliation and to decolonization. So I'll go back to Rod McInnes here. He said, with respect to genetic research with Indigenous populations, I suggest that we must now be invited into the metaphorical tent of the Indigenous communities. The multicultural and international nature of the American Society for Human Genetics creates a major opportunity for it to make this happen to the benefit of all peoples. So in that talk, and that's available if you go to the journal, the AJHG journal, volume 88, number 3, you can read that talk, very pithy. When he's talking about coming into the tent of Indigenous communities, here's kind of what he means. He's advocating that researchers recognize power differences and that researchers' cultural power has actually caused cultural harm. He argues for increasing the awareness or perspectives and concerns of Indigenous people by the scientific community. That's reconciliation, right? He's advocating people listen, learn, and change their behavior, right? He's asking for incorporating Indigenous interests into research, not only scientists' interests. Now, from what I remember, having been at that meeting and around in those early days, I was an assistant professor at that point. My book wasn't out yet on Native American DNA. These were kind of radical requests. And I remember hearing in the gossip at the meeting that year, it was in this huge convention center in Washington, D.C. It was like the mega church of science, 7,000 people, camera people up on platforms, huge PowerPoint. It was really like a mega church, these Vegas curtains, fascinating meeting to go to. They have a lot of money. I remember hearing like in the gossip around, like, this is so controversial, what's he doing? But it actually wasn't controversial. Not to say Canada is better because it's got its own other issues, which I won't get into, but these conversations were more mainstream in Canada at that time. The Canadian Institutes for Health Research had Aboriginal research guidelines in health research that McInnes was deeply involved in and was drawing from. So this is kind of mainstream federal conversation in Canada, which is not radical, but it was kind of radical at the time in the US. I think a lot has changed. A lot has changed now. And so again, because of Indigenous people becoming geneticists, becoming bioethicists, and really driving that conversation from the inside. So yeah, he talked about the CIHR guidelines. He talked about collaborative research, capacity building, which is so important, signing research contracts. So there's some accountability for how research unfolds. And so in my mind, these articles weren't written yet differentiating inclusion from reconciliation from decolonization, but rereading this history now, 11 years later, I can see that Rod McInnes and this group was moving toward decolonization. He was actively recommending reconciliation, even though the word wasn't being used at the time. He was going beyond diversity and inclusion to talk about that. And now we have to think about how we actually move toward decolonization, which I'm going to say something more about. That is the repatriation of Indigenous life. Ooh, I'm really getting towards the end of my time, and I haven't even talked about Sing yet. So let's see. Let's go to the next slide. Actually, I'm going to skip over the next slide and go to slide 11 because I want to get to decolonization. So decolonization is not a metaphor. Many of you Indigenous studies scholars in the audience will know this open access article by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, where this is very, very widely cited. Basically, decolonization brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. It's restoring resources. Decolonization is not just burning sage and having some natives come in and dance for you and opening the morning with a prayer. It is actually giving stuff back. And we can understand that literally in terms of land back, but we can also understand that as coupled with capacity building. If we think about how we can build capacity in these fields to actually restore capacity, which can then kind of pull resources out of institutions for Indigenous directed research and questions. The production of Indigenous thinkers and scientists, this involves resources. Why should Indigenous bodies and lands be researched for the benefit of the University of Toronto, all these non-Indigenous labs, building non-Indigenous people's careers, not building the governance capacities and the intellectual richness of Indigenous communities ourselves? That's a way to think about the repatriation of life, right? Life can include many material things. One of the problems we run into in these conversations is settler state society is so accustomed to thinking about Indigenous peoples as having culture. Right. And so they think all they have to do is respect our culture. Like, what does that even mean? They need to give things back. And we can think about giving back within the framework of genetic research. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, now I'm going to talk about Sing for the next 10 minutes. So this is okay, there's all kinds of questions we can get into about this, right? How do you decolonize in a world of big science? Well, we're going to be exploring that in Canada in the next 10 years of Sing programs, right? How do you do this locally? How do you do this out on the land? How do you do this without all these highfalutin laboratory facilities? How do you do this outside capitalism? I don't have answers to that yet, but at least we're asking the questions so we can sort of drive how we think about this program over the next 10 years. So Sing is summer internship for Indigenous peoples and genomics. That's our new Sing Canada logo, and maybe we can talk about that in Q&A. It was such an exciting process to go through getting that developed with a couple of Métis artists in Canada. So we're understanding genomic science and technology research and development broadly as the building of institutions, labs, human resource capacity, also includes student training. We're understanding this again within that idea of repatriating Indigenous land and life, right? And so I'll give some examples of that. If we're thinking about repatriating resources beyond land, right? We can think about bodies, remains, right? We've already thought about that a lot. Bones, blood, DNA, and other biological samples. I am shocked at what's going on around the MOVE thing. And I also haven't seen any experts on Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, weigh in on what's happening with the Africa family in Philadelphia and that everything that's going on there. And I'm wondering, maybe it's just that I'm not in the field of NAGPRA, but like, is there any conversation going on? Because scientific fields have learned through NAGPRA better practices for doing this. I really don't understand why there's this complete like vacuum in terms of dealing with the remains of those victims of state terrorism from the Africa family. So that's another question that's out there. So bones, blood, DNA, and biological samples can literally be repatriated. Governance authorities, again, can be built. This is the repatriation of life, right? Building Indigenous governance, stop getting out of the way, settler states getting out of the way from disrupting and diminishing Indigenous governance. That's a form of the repatriation of Indigenous life. Again, capacity building. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about the Sing program really quickly. This is the boring slide, but I imagine it's a great lab. We do labs on bioinformatics. I should say Sing is a 1-week long summer program meant to Sure, there's some basic science training, but what are you going to do in a week? We have lectures on what does decolonization mean, the kind of things I'm giving you a talk about, because Indigenous scientists are so focused on their science, right? Students and postdocs and new professors, they're so focused on their science. And of course, there hasn't really been a rich training in what decolonization means in their fields. So even though they're Indigenous, and a lot of the examples I give would make sense to them out of their life experience, they won't necessarily have the language that I'm using any better than a non-Indigenous student, because they're not reading alternative, or they're not reading journals of decolonization, right? They're working on their science. So we do some of that at SING too. It's also professional networking. You know, a lot of Indigenous participants that come to SING every summer in the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. We have 4 programs now. They have often been one of the only people in their science programs, like the only Indian in the room. We still use that term as an insider term in the US and Canada. And this is an amazing experience for many of them to meet all these other Indigenous people who share similar kinds of experiences of being in science. So it's just lovely to watch them network and to see what their networks have produced. Let's go to the next slide. We call it ELSI in the United States, Ethical, Legal, Social Implications Conversations. That's kind of federal rules around bioethics, and then emerging kind of tribal regulatory frameworks. It's called GELS in Canada, which is basically the same thing as ELSI. And, you know, my main point is these are baseline bioethical guidelines, right? These are what the settler state says we should uphold. And so you can imagine those bioethics are crafted within a settler state worldview. And it's not that I'm saying all those values are bad. They're not enough. And some of them are kind of in conflict with our values. So we need to think on a tribal level, what does our set of ethical frameworks look like? And then how does an Indigenous researcher and other researchers kind of converse between those federal, more universal regulatory frameworks, Western regulatory frameworks, and maybe tribal specific ethical regulatory frameworks? Those are the kinds of questions that we begin to have, and that will kind of seed this work in the world by Indigenous experts. So I'll go to the next slide, which is just a map of where we are in the world. SING Canada, founded in 2018. SING US was the first, founded in 2011 at University of Illinois, moves around the country now, hopefully coming to a university near you soon. In conversations about SING Mexico, I hear we're having conversations about a SING Pacific or SING Hawaii. We've got SING Australia that came online in 2019, and SING Aotearoa New Zealand in 2016. So, and we have these networks now building globally, and people visiting each other and speaking with one another, being on Zoom boards together and research projects and papers together. So really producing it, let's go to the next slide, a global network of Indigenous people working in and around genomics and the regulation of it, data sovereignty. These are just pictures from, and I don't know Naniba Garrison if you're in the audience, but there's a picture of Naniba there, Crystal Sosi, who's another Navajo scientist, Joe Aracheta, who's Purepecha, who's working out in South Dakota because he's married into a Lakota family, Keolu Fox in this picture on the right, who's also working on genomic stuff in Hawaii. That's where he's from. And then Katrina Claus also in the picture, who's a Navajo or Dene scientist who is now at the University of Colorado. So these are younger scientists who have come through the SING program and are now leadership globally in this area. That's a picture on the left from some of the community participants in the New Zealand program. We also get community members, so who are not trying to be scientists, but who might be regulators in tribal communities. They might be elders. They might be people who have to help broker research arrangements or think about approving research programs. They will come to the SING program for a week just to get a sense of what are the questions that Indigenous scientists are confronting? What are the challenges that they have to work with? How are they having to navigate moving between their tribal communities and the university in the world of research and science? And so it's, and what I have found, at least in Canada, I think it's probably same is true in US and the other countries, our young Indigenous scientist participants love having elders there, community people. They just love it. It was really interesting. We thought it was like a nice little icing on the cake, but it's actually really integral to their sort of experience about thinking how they move more fluidly between these communities. Let's go to the next slide. This is just a picture of SING US when it was at the University of Arizona, and the theme was cancer genomics. So not only does it change location every year, it changes themes. That was a great year. It was hot as heck though, being in Tucson in July. Remember that. It was a great meeting though. Really fantastic meeting. Let's go to the next slide just so you can see some pictures there. Slide 18, thank you. These are pictures of Sing Canada, 2018, when we were at Simon Fraser University in just outside of Vancouver in Burnaby. We had a clam and conservation genomics theme, worked with Indigenous communities there on the coast, so had a field trip out there. And that was a really interesting Sing. We had 20 participants and every single person in there but one was a woman. And many of them were mid-career people, so that was really interesting. Yeah, it was just kind of fascinating how it was so very woman dominated that year. And the one young man there who was from a tribe in the US, I said, how do you feel, being with all these women? He said, I love it. So it was a really good group. And then the one on the right is our Sing 2019 in Alberta, where we did chronic wasting disease. There's a lot of work going on in Alberta and the province and with Indigenous hunters here around chronic wasting disease. And we have some prion researchers and a whole kind of prion research institute at the University of Alberta, and Genome Alberta is really into funding this work. It's so important in our province. So that was also mostly Canadians there, but I think we had one American who was Apache, and I think White Mount Apache. And then we had a participant from Australia who came up, who was about to start, I think, her PhD in genetics over in England, and wanted to just come up and see what Sing was like, because they were anticipating starting their Sing in Australia, which they did that next winter. And then we'll go to the Sing USA slide on slide 19, the next slide, which is just pictures from many of the years in Sing. So I just wanted to show you, there were, the number is more now, but at the point the slide was made after 2019, of course, we were canceled in 2020 because of COVID, there were over 130 participants across 8 cohorts, and coming from Indigenous nations across the US, Canada, and New Zealand at that point had participated in Sing. So you're beginning to see the number of people turning out, right? And this is why we're seeing progress in the field, in part. I mean, we can't take all the credit, of course, but I think it's playing a big part. Let's go to slide 20. I know I'm from Minnesota and South Dakota originally, so I talk really fast. I'm very sorry about that for non-first English language speakers. These are just the Sing Canada workshop themes that we have in planning, and this all may change. Again, we did clam and conservation genomics, then we did chronic wasting disease. There was a Sing global meeting in Waikato in New Zealand in 2020. We had planned to do H. pylori. We had planned to do H. pylori and the microbiome this summer, but because it's COVID and we're virtual again, we're going to look at, I think we're trying to negotiate with a company right now. We want to get these portable DNA sequencers from something nanopore. Some of you in there will know. I can't remember, the Oxford Nanopore, I think that's the company. Two of the scientists on our team are working on this to get these portable DNA sequencers, but we're going to have to send those along with laptops with enough memory and processing capacity out to our participants so they can do some sampling locally. And we're thinking we're going to look at just a bacterial genome because, other organisms are too long, their genome is too big. And so we've got technical limitations to what our participants can do out remotely, right? But we're trying to work that out right now. So we're going to take a smaller cohort this year and work on that. We're thinking about going out east to Concordia and McGill next year. We've been in talks about doing one around epigenetics and intergenerational trauma. That's going to be a hard one. There's going to be a lot of social care and work that needs to be done if we're going to do something like that. It may be that we won't do it. I'm a little nervous about that, but there are Indigenous scientists working on the biological aspects of intergenerational trauma. How does trauma get embodied in our genomes, right? We know that happens. And it's an important question, but there's a lot of social care that goes into studying something like that on a community-based level. And then we're in on a grant, or we're thinking about trying to do a salmon genomics one back out west. So many universities have contacted us. The Genome Alberta, Canada, Genome Atlantic, different Genome Canada offices are really interested in funding this work. So we're in conversations about future years. Let's go to the next slide, which may be my final slide. Oh, that's just the US ones, not just the US. Those are the US ones. Let's move on from there, just the themes and then this is just 3 examples of some publications that have come out of Sing. So not only are we having the summer program, but they're actually active actively working more senior scientists with junior scientists to get them published and being strategic about, who's first, second, third author, right? Who's, where are we going to publish? How are we going to place these pieces? It's just, so there's this deep hands-on mentoring as well in terms of getting Indigenous people through science. And so that's 3 of the publications there. And they're also weighing in, of course, on policy and ethics stuff. And these were directed by Sing USA, largely these 3 publications. I'm not sure what they're working on now. I'm sure they're working on a lot of stuff. I haven't been to all their meetings lately. So I think that's all I have to say on that. And it's 2:05. We can go to the last slide, which is just our sponsors for Sing Canada 2021. So it's just a call out to our sponsors. The University of Alberta is generous. Life Labs is funding the Silent Genomes Project in British Columbia. And so they're helping fund our participants, as well as Genome Canada. And that's a bigger view of our really cool Sing Canada logo that we just finished last month. I'm going to stop there because I really like Q&A, and I'm sure there'll be some good questions where we can dig in deeper to everything I'm talking about. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. This was such a terrific talk. We're so thrilled to have you here and to learn about your work. So as I noted in my chat to everyone, we have about 158 people in the room.
Okay.
And so we're going to change how we do Q&A. I've requested folks to send me their questions. And unfortunately, you'll have to listen to my voice reading out those questions, because I'm thinking that this may be the best way to use what little time we have most efficiently. So first on my list, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read 5 questions at a time. Kim, you can answer those 5 questions, and then I'll go on to the remaining 5. Does that make sense, Kim? Is that okay?
If I can remember, I don't know if I can remember 5 in a row, but we can try.
Should we do 3?
Yeah, 3 is good. Okay, and I'm also told I need to update some Sing affiliation. So I'm going to write you, Naniban, and ask about that. I know people are just moving. Yeah. And then Max Lieberon's book, I talked about Max at University of Memorial University, Newfoundland, is Pollution is Colonialism. Just came out. Pollution is Colonialism. So, okay.
All right. Thank you. Okay. So the first question is from Siobhan. Siobhan asks, do you have any feeling for effective ways to call science folks into learning changing, in parentheses, incorporation into science education, but need the educators to buy in first? So that's the question from Siobhan. The next question is from Teo. What are your thoughts on Indigenous, Black, queer, feminist, Crip solidarities and the role of non-Indigenous groups in decolonization? And the third question is from, hold on a second, from Lucia.
Oh, can we just stop there?
Yeah, sure. And actually, you know what? The next few questions are all about Sing, so that'll be perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm too old to remember all those.
No worries.
With the role of non-Indigenous groups, I think was it in decolonization, or what was in what? The role in what beyond that?
Hold on a second. I'll have to go back to the question.
Okay.
Yes, on Indigenous, Black, queer, feminist, Crip solidarities and the roles of non-Indigenous groups in decolonization.
Well, I think about it mostly in relationship to science, I guess. But it's also a broader question. I mean, it's not only Indigenous people who are part of the colonized, right? Indigenous is not a universally applicable term. It's a contested term in some parts of the world, and if I don't work in that part of the world, I'm very careful about assuming that I know who is and is not Indigenous and how the term works there. But there are colonization, being colonized and Indigenous, it's not synonymous, is my point, right? So many of us around the world, whether we're Indigenous or not, are living with the ramifications of colonization and being colonized people. So for that reason, right, that's why these conversations are so important. What I've seen, for example, at 4S, at the Society for the Social Studies of Science, our kind of major annual or our major professional association, I really have found the most common ground and interesting things to talk about and think with queer STS people there who often tend to be younger. There's the Crip Technoscience Manifesto that came out. They're going to be on our panel. Black Technoscience is an up and coming kind of subfield. I'm not sure how they're thinking about themselves yet in relation to STS. We will also have a Black Technoscience panel at 4S this year. So just broadly, I think what I said, right? Like we have very similar critiques of the role of these kinds of savage civilized hierarchies of life in the way that science has studied all of these colonized peoples, right? The way it has used those hierarchies of life to justify dispossessing people of their land, dispossessing people of their children, right? I mean, you can relate the disproportionate number of Indigenous children and children of color in state care or provincial care. A lot of these institutions are built around these long-standing hierarchies that continue to permeate our society, even if we're not using old school racial language. So the fact that we have these analyses, I think, in common, I've come to see as I've networked in the last 10 years with critics of science and technology, but also people who want to do things differently, science informed by different frameworks. So I know that's kind of a big answer. That's within the academy, but I think more broadly, I'll just say as well, some of the thinkers that are really, really moving me and that I'm paying attention to, and I'm going to read more of this next year on sabbatical, are anti-colonial, anti-imperial Pan-Africanists. I'm really interested because they seem to be doing a lot of theorizing about sort of the interconnected struggle, not confined within this notion of indigeneity. It can include it, but it doesn't have to. So anyway, I can answer that question a lot better in a year is what I'm saying, but that's kind of where some of the thinking I'm moving towards, right? And I'm, I'm sure I'll come across a lot of other great stuff from other parts of the world that I should be reading on that. And then the first question was, I forget now, it had affective in it.
Yeah, hold on a second.
I can really only take one question.
Yeah, here's the question. Do you have any feeling for effective ways to call science folks into learning/changing? For example, incorporation into science education.
Oh, like incorporating, I don't know. Can they give me an, well, I'm not quite, do you know, I'm not sure what they mean exactly. Like, do I have examples of how to do better science education in order to accomplish the goals that I'm articulating?
Emily, could you unmute Siobhan and maybe Siobhan can ask the question directly?
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, just trying to find.
Yeah, it's a lot of people to comb through, I know.
If it's possible to raise your hand and then I can unmute you. Perfect, thank you.
Hi, Kim. From a Canadian who's in LA.
Oh, wow.
It's not you. It was sort of a shareable question. Okay, so what am I trying to really ask? I think I'm a scientist. Yeah. Hard science, not STS.
You're a scientist?
Yeah, and that's not a good thing, but I work with a lot of science educators here.
I know great scientists, yeah.
How do we get, science in quotation folks to start thinking about changing these different ways of doing science and teaching science? Like, how do you get people in that conversation at all?
Oh, like people, how do you get people like me to come?
No, like people who are so steeped in like colonial.
Oh, well, not people like me are not going to convince them. This is why we need Indigenous scientists. We need diverse scientists. We need people who know the inside language, because you're going to trust people who speak your language, right? Who have some kind of cultural common ground. That's just the truth of it. You've got to build some kind of common language. I mean, you can get to a point where you're like, yeah, diversity, I love all my diverse friends, but you have to have some kind of, and so I really, yeah, so I think I'm sure Indigenous scientists are going to be much more convincing on these issues, which is why I think they also have to be trained as well in some of this language. There's these frameworks of decolonization, because they're not going to get it in their scientific training. And they certainly have a gut feeling about it coming from their lived experience, but they're not necessarily getting the language. Like these intellectual frameworks, if you have the words for something, you can think much more complexly about it, right? And so there's probably some other answers out there, but my first answer is we must train people from the communities in the technical language as well as the critical social language. And that unfortunately means they have so much more work to do. And that is an extra barrier for them. And I'm sure a lot of them talk about that all the time, right? Diverse scientists are also called to do this extra work all the time. So is that kind of what you meant? Because anyway, she's off, but they're off. But yeah, like most of the scientists in the world are not going to listen to Kim TallBear. I'm not a scientist. So.
We have a bunch of questions about Sing. The
Okay.
first one is from Lucia, wanting to understand more about who studies with SING and how undergraduates might get involved. The second question, which is also about SING, is I'm wondering, is from Aaron. I'm wondering if you can talk about an example of the new research knowledge coming out of the SING program and how the questions or findings challenge or transform non-Indigenous genetics research.
Can I request that, Naniba, I'm going to put you on the spot, Naniba Garrison, who was in my slide, and she's a UCLA faculty. Can I request that she get unmuted
Sure.
and help answer these questions? Because
Yeah.
I'll bet you her answers are better than mine. I told her I was going to put her on the spot, so by email.
Emily, did you find Naniba?
Oh, right over here.
There she is.
Naniba has raised her
Okay.
hand. Did you find her?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So thanks for allowing me to respond to the question. I think one of the, so Indigenous scientists are really engaged in talking to other researchers. We are busy with all sorts of developing frameworks, and Kim mentioned some of those frameworks in the presentation earlier, where we are working to think about ways of engaging non-Indigenous researchers, because I think the language is very important for us to be able to respond to these questions. And one of the other things that we've been doing recently is really thinking about ancient DNA research. And this is something that has been getting the attention of even the American Society of Human Genetics. They're really interested in finding ways to develop some guidelines around that, because that's an area where human subjects research does not really apply. But there's, I would say there's a lot of effort. We've also been really interested in trying to understand how we are working with each other using we're interested in doing some social network analysis to see how we're actually working with each other to develop better science and to develop better relationships with each other, so that we can help to promote and encourage younger scientists to become engaged. But as far as working with non-Indigenous scientists, I think one of the challenges is really just to continue to be persistent and to share our research and to continue to give talks. And I think a lot of people are very interested in these frameworks. They just are looking for a tool book or a guide to actually figure out how to do this. So we just need to continue to be engaged. I hope, Kim, that answers your question. Or
yeah, and the other one was about, I think it was about undergrads in SING, or who else studies at SING, was that it? And I said something about that in the overview, but I don't know, Naniba, if you have anything else to add. I think I heard your baby in the background, so. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I had to ask to unmute again. Yes, we have undergraduate students, community members, tribal leaders, many different people who come to SING. The application process opens up once a year, and this is a way that we select students to participate. The program is typically only allowing about 20 participants per year, so it is a bit competitive, but I'm hoping that as we continue to gather more funding and more opportunities to do this, that we'll be able to expand that quite a bit further, because there are a lot of students, including non-Indigenous students, who are very interested in participating. But I think one thing that we have been doing is trying to use many different opportunities to talk about what some of the products that have come out of SING, talking about some of the papers that have come out of it and walking people through it so they can understand. So that's one way that we've been able to engage more students.
Thank you.
Did I answer everything? Sorry, before I unmute.
So far, and you're going to stick around, so if there's anything else, that's awesome. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks so much. So the next question is from Clara Welch. It's a long question, so let me read it. I'd love to hear Professor TallBear expand more about Indigenous science approaches to climate change research and mitigation. Are there different methods for Indigenous climate science? how might non-native climate change advocates best incorporate the environmental justice concerns of disproportionately affected Indigenous communities without perpetuating the perception of Native peoples as objects of science?
Yeah, so I don't work in that area, so it's hard for me to answer the specifics of the question, but the end of the question is getting at what I was saying, right? I mean, this is why it's not only important sort of the technical skills and informing methodologies, right? Scientific methodologies by methods by in ways that are more compatible with Indigenous priorities. I mean, we've seen the development of some new techniques in the genome sciences because people were thinking about what's ethical to Indigenous people, which might be quite different than what's like in ancient DNA, right? You can develop techniques that are less destructive of remains and material if you care about that, right? If you don't care about it, then you might not do that. But I don't have that experience in terms of thinking about climate science. But what I will say is that it is very important to change the narratives, right? So I'm really thinking a lot these days is getting my kind of humanities hat on. I think that the stories we tell ourselves about the world that we live in and want to live in are very much co-constitutive with building the institutions and structures in that world. In fact, I wonder if the narratives don't come first, but then we do have this kind of cross-fertilizing thing, right? If all we have is one story about how the world is, how it inevitably is, what it should be like ethically, then that's what we're going to build towards. That's what we're going to privilege. And so we really need to bring, we're working a lot in Indigenous studies with relational frameworks, right? This is happening among Indigenous thinkers across the world. We call that Wakotowin up here in Cree and Métis country. We think about being in good relation when we're in Chetishakawin country, where I'm from. So, but thinking less in terms of hierarchies and more in terms of relations, which also gets us off that kind of temporal progressive line, right? Where we're kind of in an already always present. So we always have to be accountable for what we're doing now, because we're not going to get to some inevitable, more progressive, enlightened future. What we do now is what we are. That is what we must be accountable for. We can't displace our responsibility to the future, which is part of, I think, the problem with why we are where we are at. You know, eventually we'll get there. Eventually we'll include. Eventually we'll be more enlightened. Eventually we'll be more ethical. You know, so anyway, I think this is what I'm attempting to infuse some of this work with, these relational frameworks, and that then kind of changes what we think, the kinds of methods that we might develop, for example. But I'm already losing sight of the question because I got so off on the narrative part. But I think, you know, long story short, we need to inform current research projects and questions with, I think, Indigenous analytical frameworks, and not the same old hierarchy of life, which results in sexism, racism, heteronormativity, you know, all that stuff that's coming out of those kind of older dominant frameworks. And we're really struggling against that. And I think we're going to continue to struggle unsuccessfully until we get a new story about how the world is and how it should work.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
The next question, I'm going to see if I can read two questions at a time. So the next question is from Joy Holland. I'm curious how Professor TallBear counters the probably inevitable label of being anti-science through introducing these concepts. I find that even in library science, this happens as you introduce concepts of Indigenous inclusion in meaningful ways in the field, since it disrupts the life cycle of current collecting practices. Would you like me to pause or go on to the next question?
Yeah, no. So how do you do this work without just being called anti-science all the time?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
I don't know if Nadiba has another question to that. Yeah, it comes up a lot, and I continue to do the work. I mean, I feel like, well, one of the ways I do this is I really focus on those scientists, besides working with Indigenous scientists, right? If you're talking non-Indigenous scientists who have to, I don't tend to focus on those who have to be convinced that the project needs to change. They may not know how to change it. They may not have the words for it, that, you know, but I want to work with people who are already kind of knowing that this is a problem and they want to make change, because even when you get people together who feel like they can consider the same ethical project, different languages, right? Different standpoints. It's very hard to do this work. It requires a level of trust and common commitment. I do not waste my time on the dinosaurs who are still sitting there opposing NAGPRA. I don't even, Now, I'm not saying others shouldn't do that, right? Like maybe others more inside archaeology with more technical expertise can chip away and work on that. But that's kind of where I focus. So that helps lessen a little bit me having to just deal with nonstop anti-science critique and really get down to the work of trying to make change.
The next question is from Hannah Landecker. Hannah says, thank you for a wonderful talk. The SYNC project is amazing. I'm wondering if there is debate within it about the dominant status of genomics itself, and whether there are other modes of scientific inquiry, such as epigenetics and I'm sorry, I can't pronounce.
I never can pronounce that either.
That might be more resonant with the questions of social and environmental conditions for Indigenous thriving.
See that, Hannah, thank you for that question. This is where I wish some of the scientists were with me, because yes, there are many conversations going on. And I think, but I sort of sit there and listen to the kind of young, hip critical scientists talk about this stuff, right? And a lot of our scientists that I've been working mostly with people in Canada these days, but we have a lot of people taking queer theory and adding that in with feminist theory and Indigenous theory to think about how we do these things differently. So yeah, we are thinking about what other kind of ancillary field should we be moving into. One of the long-term questions we have, and again, I have these questions, but I don't have the technical expertise. Like in doing this portable technologies and sending these out to participants this summer, I would like to not only do a SING in every province across Canada, but what something like 80% of the Canadian population or 90% is within 60 miles of the US border, right? So we're talking the South, right? All of these cosmopolitan cities. I would like to think about how we do this in the territories. Like, how do you do this work up where you don't have a big lab facility? One of the questions that came up with the chronic wasting disease SING 2 summers ago was, and this is Indigenous hunters and non-Indigenous hunters. The best way to find chronic wasting disease is apparently to cut the head of the cervid off and send it back to the lab. How many hunters are going to do that? Going to cut the head off and get it back to the lab? If we could have kind of technologies in the field to immediately kind of assess if there's, so this is the kind of stuff we're thinking about, right? And so this is why we're thinking about bringing these portable genome sequencing technologies into this. Can we then take it out? But I know that's still not totally answering your question, but we are kind of being driven towards these other questions as we think about how do we do various forms of science in ways that are away from the cosmopolitan center. Eventually, I'm interested in how do you do science in a way that's not so overly shaped by these kinds of capitalist, militaristic drivers of science and technology. I think I'm hoping we get to those questions in a meaningful way in the next 10 years. But that was a vague answer, but thank you for the question. It's a great one.
The next question is from Miri Park. Miri asks, what are your thoughts about using the acronym STEAM versus STEM? In dance studies, we are also attuned to decolonization as we examine how people move through their own subjective positions and in response to sociopolitical forces. It occurs to me that in a project surrounding epigenetic trauma, that dance, music, art-making practices as survival is intertwined with the science of the body.
I don't think about STEAM much. I mean, I'm interested to hear what the argument is for it. I mean, I can imagine I would probably better inhabit a STEAM world than a STEM world, right? Given what I do, but I don't know if it's, I haven't really thought about the term that much. I don't have any objection to it. I don't really know what the impetus was to it in terms of maybe just making clearer the kinds of things that I do in a way without having an acronym, right? That all of these forms of knowledge production and action are interconnected. And if we're thinking across these divides, we're going to do better work. I mean, I'm sure so I'm sure I would agree with whatever, but I don't use it. Should I use it?
Okay. I apologize that we haven't been able to have the same kind of dialogic conversations that we typically have. The last question, no, not the last, hopefully the second last. The next question is from Anthony Guy Lopez. Anthony asks, can you talk about the 7th generation thing that some Indigenous nations talk about and how it might inform a different kind of science?
Yeah, I mean, I don't tend to use that particular phrase a lot, but certainly it informs the way that I think about this. And I mean, I think that's an idea that we would consider if we're thinking about the sustainability of the way that we're doing science, right? I mean, it's a good question. Like it's a value that I have and that I feel like subtly informs the way that I think about this stuff, but I haven't explicitly articulated that as a value to guide like how we develop the SING program. So I'll remember that. I'll take that as a challenge actually, and think about, because they talk about a similar kind of idea up here in Cree and Métis country as well. Are we doing that? Like, are we doing that in the SING program? I have a feeling we really are, but I think we should probably explicitly articulate this kind of, how we're working now for the future, right? Like not borrowing too much from the future, which of course we are. So anyway, I thank you for that question, and I will we'll think about that explicitly in our work.
The next question is from Clark Barrett. If you can Indigenous STS provide insights to science, especially non-Indigenous scientists, about how to properly engage with Indigenous communities where they are conducting research? In particular, do you have recommendations for scientists who would like to involve community members in co-producing the research itself?
Is this person at UCLA?
Clark, yes, Clark is my colleague
Clark.
in anthropology, yes.
Oh, well, they should talk to Naniba when she said she's taking care of her kid. There are many recommendations. There are many guidelines that are coming out. I mean, I do have papers that I could have put in. I didn't think about this. I taught a course called Indigenous Technoscience this year, which is a 100-level course, but it was totally online, and I had people from all across Canada, professionals. I had engineers, I had policy. There's, I think one of our people who's a policy person in Ottawa is on actually watching it. We had I think an ecologist. So I had a lot of traditional students, but also professionals, mid-career people who just wanted, who work in organizations and institutions who wanted to understand how they bring these ideas into their ongoing work. And so what I'm saying is I can send the syllabus to anybody who's interested. It actually has lists of guidelines and readings for people. And it was meant to be an intro level course, but it ended up being a much richer conversation. So that would be a start. And there's some like ethical guidelines papers in there so they can get a sense of what's going on again in Canada, US, New Zealand, Australia around Indigenous ethics. I'd be happy to share that syllabus. So.
All right, last call for a brief question if you want to send it to me.
And I'm putting my email in the, oh, I just sent it to one person. I meant to send it to everybody. Hold on. I'm putting my email in the chat. If anybody wants to write and request that syllabus, I'll share it.
Great, great.
Yeah.
All right, wonderful. Hannah Landecker asks, what are you going to do for your sabbatical?
Oh, thank you. That's a nice question. I'm going to finish my next book, which is right now called Disrupting Sex and Nature and Indigenous Relational Logic. So I'll talk about, multiplicity of knowledges, non-monogamous relations, Indigenous ecoerotics, because my new work is on disrupting this object of sex. I want to destroy it. I want us to get back into relations. Stop fetishizing sex as good or bad. It's just one more way of relating. And I'm going to make that argument. I'm going to read old Dakota stories that are kind of racy, and look at like trickster stories and well, you would call it multi-species in a settler framework. We just call it multi-relative, right? This is what I mean. I'm going to disrupt species in there, and I'm going to focus on relatives and relations, which is dangerous ground, because then you have to think about if everybody's your relative, you don't have the human animal binary to tell you who you should eat and not eat and have sex with and not have sex with. It's very testy territory, but I really want to engage these frameworks. And then I'm probably going to work on a book. I write these critical polyamorous 100s, which are 100-word critical nonfiction vignettes about relations. They started out being about non-monogamous human relations, but then I started getting into writing about the little lizard that lived behind my house and the bats that flew over my house in Austin. So there's a lot of kind of multi-species relations as well in those, where I'm really thinking about my non-human relatives too, and thinking about stars and star knowledge. So that's going to be a book I'm hoping to pitch to a friend who has a poetry press in Ireland. She doesn't know yet, but I'm going to pitch it to her and get my other foot operated on because I have bunions. So it's going to be a great year. I mean, well, quarantine and all that, but as good as it can be in this world. So thank you for that question.
It sounds like you have a very full sabbatical coming up. There's one last question from Clara Welch. Clara says that she's curious to hear a little bit about changing attitudes to the term sovereignty in Indigenous studies.
I'm just writing a text here. I haven't really taken that on, and I'm trying to think. I mean, this person may know more. We certainly in Canada are, I mean, we always, well, not everybody uses it with scare quotes. I think we're thinking a lot about that because we're recognizing that you use, you know, Western sovereignty language, Westphalian sovereignty, you use these kinds of frameworks that you inherited / had imposed on you by settler nation states. You use those strategically. But I think we are pretty careful in many corners of Indigenous studies to understand that those are being used strategically without always necessarily calling that out. I think the move towards relational frameworks, I think, is an implicit, if not sometimes explicit, challenge to the sovereignty framework. And so I think you're going to see a lot more work in the next 5 years, particularly by younger scholars coming out in that area. I think it's a really exciting time. I mean, you know, we use tribal citizenship very strategically in the US. This is what makes sense to the colonizer. But we see how that gets in the way of the ways that we include relations. But anyway, I've also written on this. I'm about to tweet out an article that gets at some of these tribal enrollment problems. And those tribal enrollment problems are inherited both from the imposition of settler notions of the citizenship project in the 19th century. They're inherited because of racial frameworks that would whiten the Indian, you know, kill the Indian, save the man. So they're because of inherited stories, but they're also about imposed structures of governance and how in the world do we agitate against that. Part of it is bringing in our own worldviews and analytical frameworks, but of course that's only part of it, right? Like you can tell new stories, but agitating against the structures of the world's global superpower as Indigenous peoples within the US is really quite challenging. So anyway, I don't look for the I don't know if that was an answer, but I'm excited by that work too. And I'm excited about that questioning and that line of questioning, even while I kind of strategically use this other language as if it's like transparent and totally okay. It's not totally okay, but.
There was a question in the chat about whether a recording of this presentation will be available. Yes, it will be available. And perhaps my colleague Clark can send me a text about how this talk will be available, and I can then read it out to the rest of you. Typically, we have graduate students ask questions first. And today, because it was such a full room, I opened it up to the entire floor. But if there are any grad students who'd like to ask a short question, please message me and I'll read out your question.
How long are we going to?
We have another 6 minutes, 7 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, so we have some time.
Yeah. I like Q&A, so.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Any other questions, folks? Is there anything you'd like to add, Kim, before we adjourn?
You know, there was, but yeah, no, I can't think of anything. I had COVID over the holidays and I have a little COVID brain still. I'm awesome. Other than that, as far as I know, I haven't had a lung x-ray, but I do kind of like lose my train of thought from the beginning to the end of a sentence sometimes. So
sorry to hear that. Well, we do have someone who wants to ask a question.
Okay.
This is Akhil Gupta. Akhil, do you want to send me your question so I can read it out? While you're writing out your question, Akhil, I will read the message from Clark. Clark says, for the video, there will be a link through the Beck website at www.bec.ucla.edu. It'll probably be posted by early next week. All right, still waiting for the question from Akhil Gupta. Okay. So here's the question from Akhil Gupta. Kim, can you reflect a little on the difference, if any, between progressive narratives in settler colonial states and developmentalism?
No, I can't. I think that's drawing on literature. I don't know. Is there something I should read and think about? I'm turning the question back because I can't answer it.
Emily, would you like to unmute Akhil, or Akhil, do you want to send me your answer so I can read it out?
I mean, because I focus so much on Indigenous stuff, I know there's like holes in my global thinking and not being informed by theories in other fields for sure. And this is the year that I have to think about it. So.
Yeah, this is something actually that also comes from thinking about the relation between decolonizing narratives and post-colonial narratives. And this is something that who's in the audience also first brought up. But it's about basically, the question really is about how in some ways, the civilizing mission was in settler colonial states and in colonial states, and how the challenges and how, as you're talking about science as carrying this legacy on in an apolitical framework, one can see similarities with development discourse carrying this on in an apolitical framework in the context of colonized states, nation states.
Yeah.
So,
No, I have a close colleague here, Dia DaCosta, who works, I think, came out of development studies at Cornell, and she and I are quite close now. And we've been talking a lot about some of the, so we're thinking about writing a piece together actually this year about her. I think it's okay to talk about her emigrating to Canada from India, and the sort of her kind of awakening to thinking about having been a colonized but upper caste subject there, and then coming to Canada and dealing with being on, stolen land. And so we're thinking about writing a conversation, which will be an opportunity, I think, for me to be in conversation with those kinds of fields of literature and thinking that I haven't been. So I probably could answer this question better when we just started talking about writing that paper, and I'm quite excited to do that. So.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Let's see. Okay, so I have a comment from Lucia. Lucia says, wanting to add that it's been hard for me to find scholars who marry my interests in feminism, anti-colonial thought, science studies, and ecosexual art. Kim TallBear is the best. There is seemingly no department for our transdisciplinary work. Trying to develop projects as an undergrad in my last year, just want to say that I am grateful.
Oh, thank you. I have an overdue blurb for Beth Stevens and Annie Sprinkle's Ecosexual Position book too, that's coming out on University of Minnesota Press. Yeah, they've been generative for me, because I think against ecosexuality in a really generative way, right? It doesn't quite capture Indigenous ecoerotics, which Melissa Nelson also writes about, who just moved from SF State to Arizona State. But we're definitely in conversation, and it's really exciting work. And I know there's so many artists as well involved, and dancers involved in ecosexual stuff. So there are new books coming out soon. So check that out on University of Minnesota Press.
On that note, I'm going to say thank you again to Kim TallBear for this absolutely riveting and thought-provoking talk. And thanks to all of you, the rest of you, for making this such an interesting and stimulating discussion.
Thank you, everybody. Really great, diverse, interesting group. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Take care, and I will see you all next week.